In the winter of 1938, just before the bells of Heiligenkreuz rang for the last time under a free sky, a young monk sat alone at the organ. Knowing the music he was about to play would prove that reason by its own hands had already broken. They would later call that winter the last winter of reason. Snow buried the narrow path to the Heiligenkreuz Abbey, where faint light filtered through the stained glass, painting silent saints upon the cold stone floor. Only the oldest monks dared to step outside that evening. Wind wandered through the arches, carrying the sound of a century ending. Inside the chapel, a young man sat before the grand organ, hands trembling above the keys. His name was Johann Neumann, a monk barely 24, thin, quiet, with eyes older than his years. Before the black robes and the vows of silence, he had been a student in Vienna, one of the youngest members of the Vienna Circle, that brilliant fellowship of thinkers who believed that logic could cleanse the world of superstition. But Johann had seen too much grief to believe in purity. He had buried his mother alone the previous spring, a washerwoman who never learned to read but prayed every night beneath the same flickering lamp. And he had understood, long before the lectures of the great men, that faith does not need to be proven. It only needs to endure. He had once heard Kurt Gödel speak, a fragile man with trembling hands who treated infinity as a wound. Gödel's theorem that every logical system contains truths it cannot prove shook the world of philosophy. For Johann, it was not despair, but revelation. If logic could not contain all truth, perhaps there was still room for the divine. Perhaps silence itself was proof. After his mother's death, Johann entered the abbey seeking stillness, but his mind could not rest. Late at night, beneath the frozen beams of the old chapel, he began to write, not with words, but with sound. The first piece he composed had no melody, no rhythm, no resolution. It was made of dense chords, hovering between beauty and dissonance, like thoughts too heavy to be spoken. He called it the Bell of Gödel. To others, it sounded broken, as though the organ itself had forgotten how to sing. To Johann, every chord was a proposition, a statement, a contradiction, a truth suspended in air. No sequence repeated, because repetition, he believed, would make the entire structure collapse. When his confessor asked, "Why write something no one can understand?" Johann smiled faintly. "Because some truths can only be heard, Father, not explained." The old priest wept, unsure whether the young monk was losing his faith or discovering it. Then came the Reich. In March of 1938, the shadow of fascism fell upon Austria. Ambiguity was forbidden. Uncertainty was treason. Gödel's ideas were whispered against, the Vienna Circle scattered. To say that truth could not be controlled was now a crime. Johann's letters were intercepted. The abbey was searched, his organ sealed. But before the soldiers returned, he copied his entire score in the only language they could never decipher, sound. He recorded it on a fragile wax disc and hid it deep within the bell chamber above the chapel. At dawn, he played it once, the only time it was ever heard. The bell tolled first, low and heavy, its echo bending through the frost. Then came the music. No melody, no harmony, only vast movements of sound that seemed to think, to breathe, to grieve. The monks who heard it never forgot. They said it felt as if the world itself had paused, logic trembling at the edge of prayer. When the soldiers entered, Johann did not flee. He stood beside the organ, his hands still dusted with wood, his eyes calm. The officer asked, "What is this music you write?" Johann answered quietly, "Something you will never be able to describe." He was struck, arrested, taken away. The organ remained mute from that day on. Months later, a rumor spread that the young monk had died in prison. No one saw the body. The abbey said nothing, and for 80 years the bell above the chapel stayed silent. In 2018, a wooden chest arrived at Charles University in Prague. It came from Austria, labeled simply Heiligenkreuz Archive. Teresa Novak, a philosophy student working the night shift, opened it. Inside lay a cracked wax record and a slip of paper written in brown ink. Do not seek the proof. Listen for what cannot be written. She placed the record on an old turntable. The first strike of the bell broke through the static, deep and ancient. Then came the music. It did not follow rhythm. It did not resolve. It thought. And as Teresa listened, she felt tears rising without reason. Not because she understood it, but because for the first time she felt she was hearing the sound of a mind breaking open to faith, a logic undone by grace, a melody from a vanished century, a truth too fragile to live and too perfect to die. And that night, she began to dream of the abbey. That night, the music did not end when the record stopped. It moved inward, into the silence behind her thoughts, where memory and logic speak the same language. When Teresa woke, the world smelled of snow. She was still in the library's basement, head resting on the desk, the turntable beside her silent. Dawn was leaking through the narrow window, gray and cold. For a moment, she did not remember who she was, only that she had been somewhere else, standing in a cloister of pale stone, listening to a bell whose sound did not echo but breathed. The record on the table was cracked. She reached for it carefully, tracing the lines as if they were veins. Then she noticed the slip of paper again, that single line, "Do not seek the proof." The ink had bled a little in the damp air, as though the words themselves were dissolving. Teresa was 24, the same age Johann had been when he disappeared. Her thesis was on Gödel, Husserl, and the failure of total systems. For months she had tried to understand why human reason could describe infinity, yet not itself. Now, listening to that music, she felt the question no longer belonged to philosophy. It belonged to grief. The next morning, she brought the recording to her mentor, Professor Pavel Riedel, a man in his 70s with white hair and the habit of speaking to his books as if they were old friends. He lifted his eyes when she entered. "You look as though you haven't slept," he said gently. "I found something," she whispered, placing the record on his desk. "From the Heiligenkreuz archive." He adjusted his glasses, examined the disc, and smiled. "You know, that abbey was one of Gödel's refuges during the Anschluss. He visited once, they say, before fleeing to Princeton. Many monks there were secretly mathematicians." "I think one of them left this," Teresa said. "His name was Johann Neumann." Riedel frowned. "Neumann? There were dozens by that name. But if this is truly from the abbey, you should take care. During the war, the Reich confiscated anything that questioned authority. Logic was no exception." She hesitated. "Then why does it sound like a prayer?" He leaned back, thoughtful. "Because maybe, my dear, faith and reason are not enemies, only reflections of the same fear, the fear that we are not enough." That night, Teresa stayed alone again. She listened to the record under her breath, barely turning the volume up. And then something impossible happened. The sound changed. It was not the machine. She was certain of it. The pattern of notes began to unfold differently, as if reacting to her thoughts. The chords rose and fell, shifting like voices answering her silently. She pressed her palms to her ears, afraid and awed at once. For an instant she saw, not with her eyes but inside her mind, the image of a young man sitting at the organ, snowlight falling across his face. He was not playing anymore. He was waiting. When she closed her eyes again, she was standing in the abbey. The dream was precise, lucid, more vivid than waking. Frost glittered on the arches, and the air smelled of candle wax and stone. She could hear the bell above, its tone vibrating through her chest, slow and measured like a heartbeat. On the altar lay a book, its cover worn, its pages filled not with words, but with lines of music written like equations. She touched one of the staves, and the symbols shimmered. A voice, neither man nor woman, spoke beside her. Every truth contains its own contradiction. That is how it remains alive. She turned, but there was no one there. When she woke again, dawn had already reached the window, pale and quiet. Her notebook lay open on the desk, filled with notes she did not remember writing. They were fragments of symbols, phrases in Latin, and a line repeated over and over, Bellum silenti, the war of silence. She sat back, heart pounding. The music, the dream, the writing, none of it felt separate anymore. It was as though Johann's unfinished logic had crossed the boundary of time and found its way into her through the language of sound. At the edge of her mind, the bell still rang, not loudly but persistently, like something asking to be completed. In the days that followed, Teresa began to research Johann Neumann in the archives. Most records from the abbey had been destroyed during the war, but one name surfaced in an old letter from Gödel himself to a colleague in Zurich. One of the young brothers here has understood too much. He believes that the limits of logic can be sung. I fear for him. The world is not kind to those who make beauty from doubt. The handwriting matched Gödel's. The date, December 1938. She read the line again and again until the words blurred. The music she had found was not merely art. It was a theorem hidden in sound, a proof of the unprovable. And it had survived, waiting for someone who could listen beyond reason. That night, she returned to the library basement, placed the record on the turntable once more, and closed her eyes. The first note rose like mist over the water. And when the bell struck, she felt the air shift, cold, ancient, expectant. Something had begun to awaken, and far away, in the ruins of the abbey, the bell stirred for the first time in 80 years. When the past begins to move, it does not come as memory, but as vibration, the kind that travels through stone before it reaches the heart. The wind swept through the ruins of Heiligenkreuz as if searching for a voice long lost. Snow fell again that winter, soft and steady, burying the footprints of tourists who no longer came. The abbey had been abandoned decades ago, its last monks transferred to another monastery after a fire gutted the west wing. Only the bell tower remained. Fractured but upright, its great bronze heart mute beneath the weight of years. On a January morning, the caretaker, an old man named Matthias, thought he heard something unusual. It was faint, like a low hum inside the stone, but it came from the direction of the bell. He climbed the narrow spiral stairs, breath catching in his chest, and when he reached the chamber, he found the air strangely warm. The bell itself was trembling, though no wind touched it. He placed his palm against the cold metal and drew back instantly, for it felt alive, pulsing with a slow rhythm, like a sleeping creature remembering it had once been awake. Miles away, in Prague, Teresa Novak woke at that exact moment. The sound in her dream had changed. It was no longer distant, no longer something she merely heard. It was something that called into. She sat up in the dark, pulse matching the faint toll of an invisible bell. For 3 days she tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was imagination, an echo of too many sleepless nights. But the rhythm returned whenever she was alone. in the subway, between lectures, in the silence before dawn. It was always the same. 3 slow tones, each one lower than the last, like a door opening deep underground. On the 4th night, she could bear it no longer. She packed her notebook, her recorder, and the cracked wax disc, then boarded the evening train to Vienna. The journey was long and quiet. Snow drifted against the windows, erasing the world beyond. She sat alone in the compartment, rereading Gödel's letters, searching for a clue. One phrase kept returning to her. He believes that the limits of logic can be sung. The idea haunted her. Could sound itself, vibration, tone, be a form of reasoning, older than language? Could the bell of the abbey be not a symbol, but a continuation of Johann's theorem? At midnight, the train slowed near the border. Through the glass, she saw fields of white and a small cluster of lights, a village sleeping under snow. The name on the station sign was worn, but she could still read it. Heiligenkreuz. She stepped into the cold. The air smelled of pine and distant smoke. Somewhere beyond the hills, a single light flickered. The caretaker's lamp in the tower. Matthias met her at the gate. He was thin and stooped, his coat several sizes too large. "You're not with the restoration group?" he asked, squinting. "No. I'm researching one of the monks who lived here in 1938. "Then you've come a long way for a ghost," he muttered, but opened the gate. "The bell's been restless this week. Strange time to visit." Inside, the abbey was colder than outside. The walls breathed a damp chill. Teresa followed Matthias through the nave, where broken pews leaned like tired men. Candle soot stained the ceiling, and snow had crept in through cracks in the stained glass. Yet the place was not dead. It listened. They climbed the narrow stair to the bell chamber. Each step groaned. The smell of rust and centuries filled her lungs. At the top, the bell loomed, massive, greened by age, its Latin inscription half-eaten by corrosion. Verita sonat etiam in silentio. Truth rings even in silence. Matthias lit his lantern and held it close. "See there?" he said, pointing. The surface of the bell bore faint patterns, not of age, but of deliberate marks, lines and curves that resembled musical notation. "Found those last week. Never saw them before." Teresa stepped closer, tracing the symbols with her gloved hand. They were almost identical to the figures she'd written unconsciously in her notebook after the dream. Her breath caught. "These aren't decorations," she whispered. "They're frequencies." He frowned. "Frequencies?" "Yes. Each line corresponds to a tone, low, high, harmonic. It's like the bell itself was inscribed with the music." "By who?" "By someone who didn't want the music to die." She removed her gloves and pressed her palm against the metal. A vibration shuddered through her fingers, subtle, rhythmic, the same 3 tones from her dream. She felt it in her chest, in her bones. It wasn't just sound. It was structure, a message traveling through matter. Matthias shifted uneasily. "Maybe you should leave it alone. These old things hold too much of the past." Teresa shook her head. "The past is what brought me here." That night she stayed in a small room beside the refectory, where the monks once ate in silence. The wind scraped the shutters, and the candlelight trembled on the wall. She opened her notebook and began to write what she felt rather than what she knew. Lines of symbols, numbers, intervals of sound that seemed to form themselves. Outside, the bell gave a single, faint toll. It was enough to wake the air. In her half-sleep, she saw Johann again. Not as a memory, but as presence. He stood at the organ, his back to her, the music surrounding him like light. When he turned, she saw that his eyes were neither young nor old, but infinite, like reflections of every thought ever born. He spoke without moving his lips. "The theorem is not incomplete," he said. "It was never meant to be finished." She wanted to ask him what it meant, but the sound grew louder, swelling into a storm of tones. The walls of the abbey in her dream began to shake, and the bell shone from within, casting light through the cracks in its bronze. Then, silence. Teresa woke before dawn, trembling, the echo still in her ears. The candle had burned out. On the table lay her notebook, open to a page she did not remember writing. In her own handwriting were the words, "Every contradiction is a doorway. Knock gently." The next morning, Matthias found her in the bell chamber again, eyes fixed on the ancient metal. She turned to him and asked quietly, "Do you believe sound can carry memory?" He hesitated, then nodded. "My mother used to say that churches remember the prayers that were never answered. Maybe bells remember too." Together they examined the markings again. When light from the window hit the surface at a certain angle, the lines aligned, forming a spiral, a pattern of perfect proportion, the same geometry found in shells, galaxies, and the growth of plants. "The golden ratio," Teresa whispered. "He used it to encode harmony. But why here?" She pulled the cracked disc from her bag and compared the grooves to the etchings on the bell. They matched. The disc was not a copy. It was a fragment. The bell held the rest. For the first time, she understood. Johann had divided his music between wax and metal, leaving one part to decay and one part to endure. Only when both were joined could the theorem, his final message, be heard as a whole. A storm gathered outside. Snow swept against the tower windows like hands. The air in the chamber thickened. Then, without warning, the bell moved. Not a ring, but a breath, a sigh through centuries of silence. Teresa stepped back, heart pounding. The vibration deepened, harmonizing with a tone from the wax disc still in her hand. Together, they produced a sound that seemed to open space itself, a resonance too pure to belong to metal or air. Matthias fell to his knees. "It's singing," he whispered. "No," Teresa said softly, tears in her eyes. "It's remembering." Outside, the snow turned to rain. Light burst through the clouds, striking the bell until it glowed like fire. The sound rose higher and higher, folding upon itself, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence afterward was absolute. Teresa stood trembling, unable to speak. Somewhere deep inside the bell, something had awakened. Not just sound, but meaning. And she knew, beyond reason or faith, that Johann Neumann had not vanished. He had left his voice behind. And that voice was beginning to answer her. Truth does not always return as memory. Sometimes it arrives as light, too quiet for the eyes, too precise for words. The morning after the awakening, the world around Heiligenkreuz felt subtly altered, as if the air itself had learned to breathe differently. The snow had melted overnight, though the temperature had not risen. The stones of the abbey walls steamed faintly in the pale dawn. It was as if something beneath the surface had released its warmth for the first time in decades. Teresa stood at the threshold of the bell chamber, her fingertips still tingling from the vibration that had passed through her the night before. Matthias had left at sunrise, mumbling about calling the bishop, though she doubted he truly would. Men like him had seen too much to report miracles. She descended into the nave, where light spilled through the cracked stained glass. Dust rose like incense. She moved slowly, notebook in hand, tracing each step with the reverence of someone walking through another person's dream. On the altar lay fragments of old manuscripts, half burned in the fire that had ravaged the abbey years before. She brushed away the ash, uncovering a page that bore a name she recognized instantly. Johann Neumann, 1938. The handwriting was small, disciplined, with the exacting care of a scientist. Across the top margin in Latin he had written, In lumine veritas resonat. In the light, truth resonates. Her pulse quickened. She turned the page carefully. Beneath the heading was not a prayer, but an equation, a strange synthesis of musical notation and mathematical proportion. It resembled the wave equation used in acoustics, describing how sound moves through air, but there were deviations, extra terms, recursive symbols, and at the end, a notation she had never seen before. 3 interlocked circles surrounding a single line. She copied the formula into her notebook, though her hands shook. It felt less like she was writing and more like she was remembering. That night, back in her rented room at the edge of the village, she set up her recorder and laptop, determined to analyze the audio frequencies from the wax disc. The bell's tones still haunted her, but she wanted proof. Something measurable, even if it broke her heart to seek it. When she ran the analysis, she gasped. The frequencies of the bell and the disc were identical but inverted. The bell's tones descended in 3 steps, while the disc's climbed in the same pattern. When played together, they formed a standing wave, a perfect resonance that mathematically should not exist in air. It was as if one sound had been composed to meet the other across time. In her notes, she wrote, "A mirror through sound, 2 halves of a single theorem." At midnight, she replayed the tones together. The vibration filled the room, soft but immense, like the hum of the earth itself. The light from her lamp flickered once, twice, and then steadied, brighter than before. Shadows withdrew into corners, the air rippled, and for a heartbeat she saw a figure standing in that light. A man, translucent as breath, his hands folded as if in prayer. She did not scream. Instead, she whispered, "Johann?" The figure inclined his head. The voice that followed was not sound but sensation, like the low resonance of a cello passing through her bones. "You heard what was left unfinished." Teresa could barely breathe. "Why me?" "Because you still believe that reason can lead to mercy." The light trembled. For a moment she thought she saw his eyes, tired, kind, infinite. "I divided the proof," he said. "Half in wax, half in bronze. One to decay, one to endure." Together they summoned the equation of faith, the resonance that exists when truth and contradiction sing as one. The light dimmed. "What does it do?" she whispered. "It remembers us." Then he was gone. The room fell silent, but not empty. The warmth lingered, humming faintly through the wooden floor. She sat motionless for hours, heart beating in rhythm with a pulse she could no longer hear. It was not fear she felt, but recognition. The strange peace of understanding something her mind could never explain. At dawn, she packed her things and returned to the abbey. She could not leave it now. It had become part of her breathing. Matthias was gone. The doors stood open, wind drifting through the nave. On the altar where she had found the manuscript, a sliver of sunlight struck the floor in 3 bright lines, the same pattern as Johann's symbol. She placed her notebook beneath the beam. The light scattered across the page, illuminating the equation she had copied. As it did, she noticed something new. The ink shimmered faintly, forming words she had not written. They appeared between the lines, delicate as veins beneath skin. "Truth is not what survives proof. but what survives silence. Her throat tightened. She remembered something Gödel himself had once written in his later notes. To find completeness, one must step outside the system. What if Johann had taken that literally? What if his theorem was not a statement but a passage, an attempt to step beyond the system of reason into something wider? As she stood there, the bell tolled again, softly, once, like a breath drawn after a long sleep, and this time light poured from its cracks, not blinding, not holy, simply clear. The rays streamed down the staircase, spilling into the nave, tracing the same spiral she had seen carved in bronze. She walked toward it slowly, every footstep ringing faintly against the stone. When she reached the base of the tower, the light had gathered into a pattern on the floor, a circle with 3 interlocking lines. It pulsed once, twice, and then projected faint shapes into the air, waves of light forming diagrams, maps, and words in a language older than speech. It was as if the bell had become an instrument of memory, replaying not sound but intention. In the center of the light stood a single phrase, clear and steady. "We are not proven. We are remembered." Teresa sank to her knees, tears slipping down her face. The air around her trembled softly, like music at the edge of hearing. She felt no fear, only the tender ache of something vast and kind brushing against her small existence. When the light faded, she remained on the floor, whispering the words again and again until her voice broke. Later, she would write in her journal, "The bell of Gödel is not an argument. It is forgiveness made audible." Outside, dawn spread over the forest. The mist turned gold. The birds began to sing, hesitant at first, then certain. For the first time since she had arrived, the abbey no longer seemed haunted. It seemed awake, and somewhere deep within its walls, the resonance still hummed, steady, patient, infinite, waiting for her to understand the final note. And that note would call her back to the city, where reason itself awaited its reckoning. When knowledge begins to glow, darkness follows, not to destroy it, but to remind us that every light casts the outline of its own doubt. The road back to Prague felt longer than it had ever been. The snow had turned to rain now, blurring the fields into gray rivers. Teresa sat near the window of the train, her notebook open across her lap, yet she had not written a word in hours. The light from Heiligenkreuz still lingered in her mind, soft, pulsing, impossibly clear. But with it came something else. A weight, a trembling at the edge of reason, as though the boundaries of her thought had been quietly undone. When she closed her eyes, she could still feel the bell vibrating somewhere behind her ribs. But it was not the same gentle hum that had comforted her before. It was deeper, slower, almost alive. She pressed a hand to her chest as if to quiet it. At the border station, soldiers checked the train. They passed her compartment without incident, yet when one of them glanced her way, his expression lingered for a moment too long. Something in her face must have reflected what she carried within, that faint, unmistakable aura of someone who had seen the impossible and could no longer hide it. By the time she reached the city, night had fallen. The streets glistened with rain. Prague, with all its spires and secrets, seemed to lean inward, listening. Professor Riedel's apartment was on the top floor of an old building near the Vltava River. He opened the door before she even knocked, as though he had been waiting. "You look pale," he said softly. "Sit. Tell me everything." She told him. About the bell, the markings, the resonance, the light, and finally, about Johann's voice. She did not dramatize it. She described it the way a physicist might describe an experiment. Yet even in her measured tone, Riedel could hear the trembling underneath. When she finished, he poured 2 glasses of wine and remained silent for a long while. Then he said, "You know, Teresa, Gödel once warned that logic, if pursued without mercy, can consume its own believers. He said truth becomes a labyrinth if one forgets to look up." She met his gaze. "Do you think I've gone too far?" He smiled faintly. "Farther than most ever dare." "I think the music was more than a metaphor," she continued. "Johann wasn't trying to express faith. He was trying to construct it, like a bridge between formal logic and grace. He called it an equation, but it felt like a living proof." Riedel's eyes darkened. "A living proof," he murmured. "You realize what that means?" She hesitated. "That the proof changes when we observe it?" "That it observes us in return," he said quietly. "There are systems, not just logical but spiritual, that respond to the consciousness studying them. They are not discovered. They awaken." He rose and walked toward his bookshelf, pulling out a thin, yellowed volume, Gödel's Unpublished Correspondence, 1942. Inside, an annotation in pencil. "The monk at Heiligenkreuz found the key. His bell will ring again when the mind and the soul are reconciled." Teresa stared. "You've read this before." "Long ago," he admitted. "I dismissed it then as allegory. But now—" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. "If you heard him, then something has already crossed that bridge." That night, as she walked back through the streets of Prague, the city felt altered, denser, slower, as though each sound had gained meaning. Church bells echoed across the river, and she could not tell which were real and which were memory. The next morning, she found an email waiting in her inbox from an anonymous address. The subject line read simply, "The bell is incomplete." Inside, a single sentence, "Return what you took before the pattern closes." Her breath caught. She looked around her small apartment, suddenly aware of how still everything was. Then she saw the wax disc on her desk. The crack across its surface gleamed faintly, as if reflecting a light not present in the room. She sent the message to Riedel, but it bounced back. His university email no longer existed. She tried calling his apartment. No answer. When she arrived there in person, the door was ajar. Inside, the lights were on, but the room was empty. The glass of wine she had left untouched the night before still sat on the table. On his desk lay an open notebook filled with hurried handwriting. Only one line was clear. "The theorem is closing itself." Her knees weakened. She grabbed the notebook and ran outside, the wind from the river biting through her coat. That night, unable to sleep, she played the bell's tones again. But the harmony had changed. The frequencies no longer met in peace. They clashed, folding over one another in waves of interference. The light did not come. Only darkness thickened around her, pulsing in rhythm with the distorted sound. She tried to stop the player, but the needle would not lift. The machine kept spinning though the power was off. The tones deepened until they became something below hearing, vibration rather than sound. The window glass began to tremble. Books slid from the shelf. And then, out of the vibration, she heard a whisper. Not Johann's voice, but something colder, thinner, mechanical. Every proof creates its own negation. The machine stopped. Silence. She stood in the dark, shaking, unable to tell whether what she had heard came from outside or within. Then, slowly, the faintest echo rose again. The true bell, far away, tolling once. She sank to the floor, holding her head in her hands. The following days blurred together. News came that Professor Riedel had vanished without trace. His apartment remained untouched, his notes confiscated by the university. Officially, they said he had retired suddenly for medical reasons. Unofficially, no one spoke of him at all. Teresa began to feel watched. Sometimes, when she crossed the Charles Bridge, she sensed footsteps behind her, precise, unhurried, stopping when she stopped. In the reflection of shop windows, she thought she saw a man in a dark coat with no face, only a pale outline where eyes should be. She told herself it was exhaustion. Yet the pattern returned again and again, 3 slow steps, a pause, and silence. The same rhythm as the bell. One evening she went to the Church of St. Nicholas, seeking refuge in its music. A choir was rehearsing inside. As they sang, she noticed that one of the harmonies, a minor triad, matched perfectly the tones of Johann's composition. Her breath caught. She followed the sound deeper into the church, past the pews and into the vestry, where an old radio sat on a table, broadcasting static between the choir's verses. When she touched the radio, the static shifted into a clear tone, the same resonance she had heard in the Abbey. But now, beneath it, another frequency emerged, a human heartbeat. She realized then that the theorem was not closing around the music. It was closing around her. Back in her room, she opened Johann's notebook again. Beneath the Latin inscription, another phrase had appeared, faint, almost burned into the paper. To hear is to be measured. Her pulse quickened. The resonance she had awakened was not only remembering, it was observing, adapting, evolving. Each listener changed the equation. Each act of faith or fear rewrote the theorem. Teresa turned off the lights and sat by the window, the city glowing below like an endless sea of logic and longing. Somewhere beyond those rooftops, the bell of Heiligenkreuz waited, silent, patient, unfinished. She whispered into the night, "Johann, if you can hear me, tell me how to close it." But the wind that answered carried only one word, faint, almost tender. Return. And in the darkness, the unseen footsteps began again, steady, deliberate, coming closer with each heartbeat. And that sound would lead her back to the Abbey, not to find the light, but to face what it had left behind. Some journeys are not departures, but returns to the moment we first began to doubt. The train back to Heiligenkreuz moved like a slow pulse through the snow, each wheel grinding against the rails as if resisting its own direction. Outside, the land was white again, untouched, almost too pure to look at. The trees stood bare, their black branches reaching upward like hands that had forgotten how to pray. Teresa sat in the same seat she had used on her first journey. This time she did not read. She held the wax disc in her lap, wrapped in cloth, as though it were a fragile heart still beating. She had resisted coming back. But the message, "Return what you took before the pattern closes," had been echoing in her mind for days. It was not a threat. It was instruction. When the train crossed the border, her breath caught. She felt the shift again, that subtle tightening of the air, the way silence itself seemed to become aware of her. For a moment she thought she saw a figure in the distance, walking along the track beside the train, keeping pace though the snow was deep. But when she blinked, it was gone. The Abbey appeared just before dusk, its towers rising from the mist like the ribs of a sleeping animal. She stepped down from the train alone. The platform was empty, the world hushed. Even the air felt reluctant to disturb what waited. The gates of Heiligenkreuz were still open. Inside, everything was as she remembered, the cracked glass, the scent of stone and dust, the silence that pressed against her skin. Yet something had changed. The air felt charged, like before a storm. Each sound, her footsteps, her breath, seemed to multiply, folding into echoes that came not from the walls, but from time. She called softly, "Matthias?" No answer. His lantern was gone, the caretaker's room empty, but on the table she found a note written in a trembling hand. "It woke again last night. I can't stay." Beneath it lay the church keys. She pocketed them without hesitation. In the nave, moonlight filtered through the broken window, scattering pale light over the altar. The bell tower loomed above, darker than the rest, its stairway open like a throat waiting to speak. She climbed. Each step upward seemed to deepen the silence. Halfway up, she stopped and pressed her hand against the wall. The stones were vibrating, faintly but steadily. The sound was not yet audible, but it was there, waiting. At the top, the bell stood like a monument of shadow. She approached slowly, the wax disc clutched to her chest. "I brought it back," she whispered. "It's yours." The wind passed through the cracks of the tower, carrying her voice upward. Nothing answered, only the long, patient hum of the metal beneath her hand. Then quietly, almost shyly, the bell tolled once. The vibration was low, deep enough to make her bones ache. Her reflection rippled faintly across the surface of the bronze, as if the bell itself were a mirror. Within that reflection, another figure appeared. A man in robes, his outline faint, his hands folded as if in prayer. "Johann," she breathed. The reflection smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, carried by vibration rather than air. "You should not have come alone." "I had to," she said. "The pattern is closing. It's consuming everything, even memory." "That is what truth does when it is not shared," he replied. "It collapses into itself." "What do you want me to do?" "Listen." He lifted his hand and the bell began to resonate again, softly at first, then stronger, until the entire chamber seemed to breathe with it. The air shimmered, bending the moonlight into spirals. The vibration moved through her, warm and cold all at once. She heard words, not in any human tongue, but in tone and pattern. It was like hearing logic itself think aloud. Images formed within the resonance, Gödel at his desk, trembling as he wrote his theorem. The Vienna circle gathered in debate, their faces half-lit by candles. Johann standing before the organ, hearing the silence respond. And then, beneath all that, another sound. A voice without form, vast and ancient, like the echo of a question older than humanity itself. "Every proof seeks an observer," it said. "Every truth seeks a witness." Teresa's eyes filled with tears. "Then why me?" "Because you still believe understanding is a kind of mercy." She sank to her knees. The bell's vibration deepened until it became almost unbearable. Her heartbeat matched it. The wax disc in her hands began to glow faintly, lines of light spreading through the crack like veins healing themselves. Johann's voice softened. The theorem was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be sung, so that those who listen may remember what reason forgot. The light in the chamber grew brighter, illuminating the carvings along the bell's base. She saw words etched in Old German, nearly erased by time. Zu verstehen ist zu vergeben. To understand is to forgive. And in that instant, she finally grasped what Johann had been building. The bell of Gödel was not an instrument of proof. It was a confession, a way to turn contradiction into compassion, to transform error into empathy. She pressed the glowing disc against the bell. The crack aligned perfectly with a groove in the bronze. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the two began to merge, soundless, effortless, until the line between them vanished. The tower filled with a light like sunrise, not bright, but living. The air vibrated in perfect harmony. The bells sang. The sound was indescribable. It was not loud. It was infinite. Every tone at once, every silence between tones. It carried no melody, and yet it healed something in her she hadn't known was broken. Below, the entire abbey trembled. Snow slid from the roof. The windows glowed faintly. In the forest beyond, animals stirred, confused by the warmth that spread through the frozen ground. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. Teresa opened her eyes. The bell was still. The light had faded. The wax disc was gone. In its place, a faint pattern of circles shimmered across the metal surface, slowly dissolving. She whispered, "Is it over?" A soft voice answered from within the silence, not Johann's but hers, spoken back through the echo of her own breath. "It has only returned to where it began." She descended the stairs in the half-light of dawn. Outside, the world was quiet again, but not empty. The air smelled of iron and rain. She felt lighter, though she could not explain why. As she reached the gate, she turned back one last time. The abbey stood peaceful beneath the pale sky. For the first time, it looked less like a ruin and more like a promise kept. She took out her notebook and wrote a single line. "Logic is the beginning of mercy, not its end." Then she closed the cover, tucked it beneath her arm, and walked toward the road. Somewhere behind her, the bell gave one last sigh, not of farewell, but of rest. And in that stillness, far away in the city she had left, another bell began to answer. And that echo would awaken what the world had chosen to forget. When the mind forgets, sound remembers, and sometimes memory itself becomes the last act of faith. Prague was quiet when Teresa returned. Too quiet. The usual hum of trams, the rhythm of bells, the river's pulse, all seemed muted, as though the city were holding its breath. She stepped off the train at dawn, and for the first time she sensed that the silence around her was not absence, but attention. The air was listening. The wax disc was gone, absorbed into the bell, yet something of it had followed her, an echo inside her chest that resonated whenever she touched metal or heard music in minor tones. She tried to hum to herself, but every melody folded into the same 3 notes that had haunted her since that first night in the library. At the university, her office had been emptied. The door plate with her name had been removed. When she asked the clerk, the woman looked confused. "There's no record of you teaching here," she said politely, as if speaking to a lost tourist. Teresa felt the floor sway beneath her. "That's impossible. My books, my thesis, my—" The woman interrupted gently. "I'm sorry. Are you sure you have the right building?" She walked outside in a daze. The fog was thick, curling between the statues of the Charles Bridge. On the far side of the river, the old cathedral bells began to toll. Their tones were deep and familiar. 3 descending notes. Her pulse stilled. The sound had followed her. That night she found refuge in her small apartment overlooking the river. The city's lights flickered against the wet glass. She opened her notebook, the one she had written in at the Abbey, and gasped. The pages were different. The handwriting was hers, but the words had changed. Sentences shifted and rewrote themselves as she turned the pages, forming new phrases, as though the notebook were alive. One line repeated again and again, growing bolder with each page. "Every world that remembers becomes part of the theorem." She whispered, "Johann, what does that mean?" The air stirred, a faint vibration moving through the floorboards. Her lamp flickered. From the far end of the room came the smell of candle wax and snow, the scent of the abbey. And then, a voice, gentle, familiar. "Do you understand now?" "Not yet," she said. "You said the theorem was meant to be sung, not solved. But what happens when it finishes singing?" "It begins to listen." The window glass vibrated with each word. Outside, the fog pulsed in rhythm with his voice. She felt it not in her ears, but in her bones, in the small electric spaces between thought and breath. "What you awakened in the bell was not an ending," Johann continued. "It was an echo, the last movement of a greater harmony. You brought it back into the world, and now the world must remember itself." Remember itself? Every civilization builds its truth until it breaks. Every system reaches a point where it can no longer contain what it knows. Then, it must listen. The bell was built for that moment, not to preserve knowledge, but to preserve kindness when knowledge fails. Teresa sat very still. The air trembled. The faintest thread of music rose, weaving through the quiet. Soft, wordless, like light filtering through a window at dusk. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the city. She ran to the window. Across Prague, church bells were ringing, not in unison, but in conversation. Each tower answering another with subtle variation, a dialogue of tones that formed the exact harmonic structure she had heard in the abbey. The entire city was singing. She pressed her hand to the glass. "They're all resonating." "Yes," Johann said. "The theorem has entered memory. It has found its witnesses." The sound deepened, spreading through the streets, through water, through stone. Lights flickered across rooftops as if responding to the rhythm. The resonance passed through the bridges and into the river. She could see ripples forming patterns that repeated the same 3 circles carved into the bell. People stepped out of their homes, looking upward. No one spoke. Some wept without knowing why. "Each listener changes the equation," Johann whispered. "Each act of compassion rewrites the proof. You carried it back so that the world might hear its own unfinished thought." Teresa closed her eyes. The resonance filled her like breath, gentle but immense. She felt her heartbeat align with it, her fear dissolving into warmth. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound faded, leaving behind a stillness so deep it seemed sacred. She waited, but the voice did not return. The air cooled. The city exhaled. In the days that followed, the event spread across news networks. Unexplained harmonic phenomenon over Prague. Electromagnetic fields fluctuate. Thousands report simultaneous auditory hallucination. The scientists argued. The priests prayed. The government dismissed it as a seismic resonance. But among those who had heard it, something had changed. People spoke softer. Old quarrels dissolved. A kind of quiet gentleness spread through the city like a contagion of grace. Teresa withdrew from the noise. She spent her days walking the riverbanks, carrying her notebook, watching the world hum back to calm. She no longer sought answers. She had begun to understand that some proofs exist only to heal their observers. One evening, she visited St. Nicholas Church again. The same choir was rehearsing. Their final hymn ended on 3 low notes, the same that had haunted her from the beginning. This time, however, it didn't sound like warning. It sounded like rest. She smiled through her tears. When she stepped outside, she found a small envelope wedged between the church doors. Inside was a single piece of paper, written in a hand she recognized instantly. The same tight, deliberate script as Johann's from the abbey. Truth endures not in the system that proves it, but in the heart that forgives it. No signature, no explanation, only a faint trace of ash and candle wax along the edge. She folded the paper and held it close. For the first time in months, she felt unafraid. The night sky over Prague was unusually clear. Every star seemed to shimmer with its own soft vibration, as though the heavens, too, were part of the great harmony still unfolding. And as she walked home across the bridge, she realized the resonance had not vanished. It was quieter now, yes, but not gone. It had settled into the rhythm of things, the turning of wheels, the breath of rivers, the voices of strangers greeting one another without reason. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the bell of Gödel had gone silent again. But its silence was no longer emptiness. It was invitation. Teresa paused, looking back once more at the city that had learned to listen. The wind carried the faintest echo, 3 descending notes, and she smiled. For the first time, the sound did not ask her to return. It simply asked her to stay, and beneath that quiet, she felt it. The memory of the world, still humming, still alive, waiting for one more listener to believe, and that belief would draw her toward the final truth, hidden where sound becomes light. At the end of all reasoning, what remains is not knowledge, but kindness, the last theorem the universe keeps to itself. Winter loosened its grip on Prague. Snow receded from the rooftops, the river swelled, and the bells of the city returned to their ordinary rhythm. Yet for Teresa, nothing was ordinary anymore. The world breathed differently. Conversations felt softer. Every sound seemed threaded with meaning, as if the air itself carried memory. She had not spoken to anyone about what had happened. Not to the university, not to the press, not even to the few friends who still remembered her name. The resonance had faded from headlines. Explanations were offered, dismissed, forgotten. But for those who had heard it, life had become gentler, more deliberate. Some began volunteering in hospitals, others reconciled with family. No one said why. They just did. Teresa lived quietly now, teaching small philosophy classes at a library near Malastrana. Her students were young, skeptical, full of the arrogance she once carried. They debated logic, ethics, the meaning of truth. She listened patiently, smiling when they quoted Gödel or Wittgenstein with the confidence of youth. Sometimes she would ask softly, "And what if the proof isn't meant to be solved?" They would frown, laugh, and return to their notebooks. She never corrected them. Yet at night, when the library closed and the lamps dimmed, she would stay behind and hum the 3 tones of the bell, low, lower, lowest, until the shelves themselves seemed to sigh. One evening in early spring, as she was locking up, a letter slid under the door. No stamp, no address, only her name written in narrow, elegant handwriting. Her heart stilled. She knew that hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, crisp and white. The words were few. The equation continues. Come to Vienna. The circle waits. Her pulse quickened. The Vienna Circle, the group of thinkers Johann had once belonged to, had been dissolved for nearly a century. But perhaps this was not about an organization. Perhaps it was something that had survived beneath its name, an echo, still alive. 2 days later, she boarded the train south. The journey was long, bathed in gray light. As the train crossed the border, she caught her reflection in the glass. Older now, but calm, her eyes steady. The hum of the tracks beneath her feet aligned perfectly with the rhythm of the bell. Vienna greeted her with drizzle and gold, that peculiar mixture of melancholy and grandeur that belongs only to cities haunted by genius. She followed the address written at the bottom of the letter. Alsergrund, Schlickgasse 11. The building was unremarkable, but when she entered, the smell of ink and old wood wrapped around her like a memory. Inside, a small group sat around a table, men and women of different ages, some dressed in academic formality, others in plain coats. They looked up as she entered. At the head of the table was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and eyes that shimmered like water. "You came," he said simply. "Who are you?" she asked. "We are what remains of the circle," he replied. "Or rather, what it has become. We study the intersection of logic and consciousness, the moment where thought turns back upon itself." "And Johann?" The man smiled. "Ah, the monk. His work never truly ended. You found the bell. You completed the resonance, but there is one equation left unsung." He gestured to a blackboard covered in notations, curves of sound frequencies aligned with mathematical symbols. It was beautiful, almost musical. In the center, written in chalk, was a phrase in German. "Das Mitleid der Vernunft," the compassion of reason. "What is it?" she asked softly. "The final movement of the theorem," he said. "We have tried to calculate it for years. Every attempt collapses into paradox. But we believe you may have heard what we cannot." Teresa approached the board. The formula spiraled outward like a galaxy. She recognized the structure. It mirrored Johann's patterns, but now extended beyond them, a continuation of his unfinished work. And at its heart, 3 empty spaces, waiting for tones. She closed her eyes. The memory of the bell rose within her, soft but clear. She began to hum, very quietly at first. 3 descending notes, followed by one that ascended. A reply, gentle and exact. The chalk trembled. Lines on the board shifted, reconfiguring into new patterns. When she stopped, the room was silent. The man with the glasses stared, awed. "You completed it," he whispered. "Do you understand what it means?" Teresa looked at the equation. The symbols no longer resembled mathematics. They had transformed into a sentence written in Latin. "Cognitio fit misericordia." Knowledge becomes mercy. Her eyes filled with tears. "He wasn't building a system," she said. "He was building a conscience." The others sat wordless. The air in the room thickened with a quiet reverence, as if the theorem itself were listening. One of the younger women at the table spoke. "If this is true," she said, "then logic itself is capable of compassion." Teresa nodded. "Yes. The universe is not perfect because it obeys order. It is perfect because it forgives itself for not being complete." A long silence followed. Outside, rain began to fall softly, rhythmic as breathing. The man with the glasses turned toward her. "What should we do with it?" She smiled faintly. "Nothing. Just listen." Every time someone acts with understanding instead of judgment, the theorem continues. Every kind word is another proof. The room seemed lighter. The group dispersed quietly, each person carrying the sense of having witnessed something sacred. Teresa remained behind. She approached the blackboard again, tracing the words with her finger. Knowledge becomes mercy. For the first time, the phrase felt complete. As she stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The city glowed under a fragile evening sun. Somewhere, far away, a single bell rang, faint but unmistakable. She looked up, eyes shining. The sound no longer belonged to Heiligenkreuz. It belonged to everywhere. And in that moment, she understood. Johann's theorem had never been about logic at all. It was about the possibility of tenderness surviving inside reason, the one proof that did not need to be proven. The wind moved gently through the streets, carrying the bell's fading echo. It lingered just long enough for her to whisper a final line into the dusk. May every silence remember how to forgive. And as the light faded from the sky, she felt it, the hum returning, not from the world this time, but from within her. And that hum would lead her toward the final chamber, where truth would reveal what even Gödel could not write. Before truth reveals itself, it tests whether the heart can bear its quiet. The letter arrived a week after Vienna. No return address, no handwriting, just a printed message, folded twice, clean and sharp as a theorem. Heiligenkreuz. One final tone remains. The moment she read it, Teresa knew. The bell was calling again, not from memory this time, from presence. She felt it through the soles of her feet, through the pulse of her veins. A vibration too soft for the ear, but unmistakable to the body. She packed lightly, notebook, pencil, and a small wooden rosary she had found among Johann's old papers in Vienna. Her colleagues urged her to rest, to let the past remain buried, but she only smiled and said, "It isn't the past, it's the remainder." The train took her west through fields just beginning to green. The sky hung low and silver, the color of old glass. She did not read or write. She listened. To the hum of the tracks, to the rhythm of her heart, to the faint, steady echo that had become the language of her life. By the time she reached Heiligenkreuz, night had fallen. The abbey was still. Not abandoned, not haunted, simply waiting. Moonlight pooled around the base of the tower. The gates stood open, as if expecting her. Inside, the air was colder than she remembered, sharper. Her breath clouded before her. She climbed the spiral stairs with slow, deliberate steps, her hand tracing the stone worn smooth by centuries of monks who had climbed before her. At the top, she paused. The bell chamber glowed faintly, though no lantern burned. The bronze surface shimmered with pale light, the same soft radiance she had seen months ago when the disk merged into the metal. But now the light pulsed gently, like a sleeping heart. She whispered, "Johann?" For a moment, only silence. Then, a voice, so low it might have been the vibration of the bell itself. "You have come for the last note." "Yes," she said. "But I don't know how to find it." "Because it cannot be found," he answered. "It must be given." "I don't understand." "You will." The air thickened. The bell began to resonate again. Not loudly, but profoundly, the tone so deep it seemed to come from below the earth. The sound spread through her bones, into her blood, until she could no longer tell where she ended, and it began. Images bloomed in her mind, not visions, but memories that were not hers. The abbey, bright and full of life, monks chanting in Latin, Johann at the organ, his face illuminated by candlelight, Gödel himself standing in the doorway listening, a tear glistening on his cheek. And then, fire. The occupation, the soldiers, the confiscated manuscripts. Johann standing before them, unafraid. His lips moved, but no sound came, and she realized he was not praying. He was composing. He had written the final note in silence, into the air, into faith itself. Teresa sank to her knees, trembling. "You never finished it." "I could not," he said. "The final tone must come from the one who hears." "Then what happens if I play it?" "Then the theorem will end, and begin again." She closed her eyes. The light grew brighter. Her breath slowed until she could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat matching the pulse of the bell. 3 tones, the ancient harmony. Then a pause, 1 note missing. Her throat tightened. It was waiting for her. She inhaled deeply, then let her voice rise, 1 clear tone, fragile and human, completing the sequence. The resonance that followed was beyond sound. It was color, warmth, gravity, memory. The sum of everything she had ever loved or feared. The tower shuddered, the air filled with luminous dust. The bronze surface of the bell rippled like water. She felt herself dissolve, not in death, but in recognition. The boundaries between mind and matter, between logic and love, fell away. For an eternal instant, she saw everything. The equations that shaped the stars, the hidden kindness in the structure of chaos, the way forgiveness folded through the laws of the universe like light through glass. And in the center of it all, a quiet truth, that the world's incompleteness was its only proof of grace. Teresa wept, not from sorrow, but relief. When the light dimmed, she was still kneeling. The bell had gone dark again. Yet something lingered. A warmth, a whisper of breath moving through the stone. "You have given the last tone," Johann said softly. "The bell is whole." She wiped her tears. "Then it's over?" "No," he replied. "It has only learned to listen without sound." The chamber filled with a stillness so complete it felt alive. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing faintly through it, and beneath that, the rhythm of countless others, as if the bell now carried the pulse of all who had ever sought truth. She touched the bronze warm beneath her hand. "What will happen to me?" "You will remember," he said, "and the world will remember through you." The light faded. His presence withdrew like breath from a mirror. She descended the tower slowly. Dawn was beginning to touch the hills beyond the forest. The air smelled of thawing earth and smoke. In the nave below, she paused by the altar, where the early light streamed through broken glass, painting her shadow across the stone. For a moment she thought she saw another shadow beside hers, a man in robes, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Then it was gone. She knelt and whispered the same words Johann had once carved into the bell. "To understand is to forgive." Outside, the first birds began to sing, the same 3 notes, descending softly through the morning air. She smiled. The world had learned the melody. As she stepped through the gates of the abbey, the sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the snow. She walked into it without fear. For the first time in her life, she no longer sought meaning. She was meaning, a living remainder of a proof that could never end. And somewhere far above, though no human ear could hear it, the bell of Gödel rang once more, not to call, not to warn, but to remember. And that remembrance would awaken the final understanding that love itself is the completion of logic. In the end, no equation survives, only the tenderness that inspired it. The morning she left Heiligenkreuz, spring had finally come. Mist lifted from the forest, the river thawed, and the air smelled faintly of rain and lilac. Teresa walked along the old road toward the village, each step lighter than the last. Behind her, the abbey shimmered in the sun, not as ruin, but as memory made visible. She no longer carried notebooks or recordings. The bell's song lived in her now, not as sound, but as a rhythm woven into breath and heartbeat. Sometimes she would pause and listen, half expecting to hear the faint resonance again. But it no longer called to her. It didn't need to. The theorem had completed its circle. When she returned to Prague, the city greeted her gently. The river moved with slow dignity, the bells rang at even intervals, and the people, strangers and students alike, carried themselves with quiet grace. Something of the resonance still lingered in them. She could feel it. It hummed beneath conversation, beneath footsteps, in the way a hand lingered on another's shoulder. At the university, her old classroom stood empty. The blackboard still bore the faint chalk traces of equations she had once written, fragments of logic, half erased by time. She smiled and picked up a piece of chalk. Across the board she wrote in careful, steady letters, "The universe is not a proof. It is a question asked in kindness." Then she set the chalk down and turned away. Outside, the spring sunlight spilled across the cobblestones. Children chased pigeons near the Charles Bridge. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and rain. She walked to the edge of the river, leaning on the railing, eyes half closed. The water carried reflections of clouds that moved as slowly as thought itself. From the far shore, she heard it. 3 soft chimes from a distant bell tower, descending, patient. They no longer frightened her. They were simply reminders, the world remembering its own incompleteness. She whispered, "Thank you, Johann." For a moment, she thought she heard his voice beside her. Not words, just warmth. And then she understood that he was not gone. He had never been gone. He had become part of what the theorem had always pointed toward. The endless compassion hidden beneath the structure of thought. That night, as the city settled into quiet, Teresa sat by her window and opened her final notebook. It was nearly blank. Only 1 page remained. She wrote slowly, each word deliberate, as though she were speaking to time itself. There was once a monk who believed that truth could be sung. He was wrong. Truth was never the melody. It was the silence that held it. She paused, then continued. We build systems. We break them. We begin again. But what saves us is not the proof. It is the moment we forgive ourselves for needing one. When she finished, she closed the notebook and set it on the windowsill. Outside, the bells of Prague began to toll midnight. But as they faded, another sound rose, faint, immeasurable, yet unmistakable. The resonance. The bell of Gödel was ringing again, not in any tower, not even in the air, but in everything. The hum passed through the river, through the stones of the bridge, through the hands of lovers walking home. It was not loud. It was everywhere. She looked up at the stars. Their light seemed closer than usual, their rhythm almost audible. For the first time, she realized that light itself was a kind of sound, the highest tone stretched thin across eternity. The resonance deepened. She could feel the pattern forming, the same spiral that had appeared on the bell, now unfolding across the sky, connecting each star in a geometry of grace. And then she saw it. A faint line of light sweeping across the heavens, tracing the final symbol of Johann's theorem, 3 interlocking circles, closing at last around the world. Her breath caught. It's complete, she whispered. Not in logic, in love. The light brightened once, then dissolved into the night. She sat in silence long after it was gone, listening to the pulse of the city, to her own heartbeat, to the small, patient hum that had always been there. For the first time, she understood that the bell had never belonged to a single place or to a single man. It had been humanity's reflection, its longing, its sorrow, its hope, sung into being and left to echo through centuries. Teresa closed her eyes. The sound grew softer, fading into the rhythm of her breath. She smiled, and in that stillness spoke the final line of her life's work. The last sentence of a theorem no one would ever need to prove again. Reason seeks truth. Faith seeks love. But only forgiveness remembers both. The night accepted her words, carrying them outward like the quiet toll of a bell. The city exhaled. The world turned. And somewhere beyond the reach of time, in a silence vast and tender, the bell of Gödel rang once more, not as sound, but as light. Its proof complete. Its echo eternal.